The history of New Mexico is etched in its land, reflected in its waters, and symbolized in its traditions. Nowhere is that history embodied more fully than in Las Mercedes, or land grants, and none loom larger than Atrisco, the first merced officially recognized in New Mexico after the Reconquista of 1692. Back then, Atrisco was a remote outpost on the frontier of New Spain, a stop on the Camino Real and home to a smattering of mostly Spanish settlers. Today, more than 300 years later, the giant footprint of the grant absorbs the inexorable growth of New Mexico's largest city westward from the Rio Grande. But to understand the past, present, and future of Atrisco, one must grasp the concept of querencia, the place where you are your most authentic self, the place you draw your strength from, the place you feel truly at home.
I would define it as a long-standing relationship to place.
It's basically your connection to your land, your connection to your community, your obligations to your community.
A human can be sort of melded with the landscape, almost like water.
And we get that love of the land from I think the agricultural heritage, people knowing that they're in tune with nature.
You know when the rainy season is, you know kind of when it's time to start cooling the crops, things like that.
It's also taking care of that place, that you have a responsibility to the community, you have responsibility to the landscape, you have responsibility to the environment.
And it's also ties to one another, mutual aid societies, groups, connections, things like that.
What I learned most from speaking with folks in the land grants is just how much that the human connection to that landscape mattered to them and that they were willing to fight for it.
We are the land ourselves. We are that water.
It really is an experience. It's a connection that's felt within the core of one's being.
The name Atrisco is a nod to some of the earliest visitors to the area, Tlaxcalteca Indians and other Indios Mexicanos, invited by Juan de Oñate in 1598 to travel north and help settle the new territory.
The original place name is Atlisco, which is a Nahuatl term, a Mexican Indian term, which means place on the water. The water is the Rio Grande River.
Spanish colonists considered the vast area between the pueblos of Sandia and Isleta, west of the Rio Grande, prime land for farming and grazing, and established homesteads there by the 1660s. The settlers were driven out in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. But soon after Diego de Vargas returned in 1692 to reconquer the territory, he granted 40,000 acres in Atrisco to Fernando Duran y Chavez and a group of Spanish-Mexican settlers on the condition they proved they could survive on the land.
They were put in possession directly by de Vargas. He says, this group of 22 odd families, this is your grant. That system was made really to populate northern New Spain and what was a Mexican territory's claim to this part of North America.
They were specifically to help sustain that community, to make sure that there was a place to live, a small plot of land, what they call the ejidos, which were the common land, were the grazing lands, the hunting lands, the fuelwood gathering lands, in which community shared in those resources in which to maintain themselves collectively.
In 1703, the provincial government officially recognized the community of Atrisco, 3 years prior to the founding of the Villa de Albuquerque. In 1768, the settlers acquired an additional 26,000 acres, extending the land grant west to the Rio Puerco.
The importance of becoming becoming part of a land grant is that you were able to work a piece of land. You were able to work yourself out of servitude. It was a way to move yourself out of poverty.
There were organizations, around acequias, around religious institutions that were more than that. They were social support systems.
My grandpa who raised me would take us out to the west side, west of Unser, where we would go hunt rabbits and hunt dove and quail. And he would always tell me, you know what, mijito, this land belongs to all of us. This land was our ancestors. This is something that no one can ever take away. This is our patrimony. This is something that's been passed down between the generations, and it's something that we have to take care of and that we will always have.
Your land becomes the basis of your identity. So more so than being important as a Spanish citizen or a citizen of Mexico, or now in the idea of being even New Mexican or American, more importantly is that I am a land grant member. I belong to a group of people, a community that exists on its own through a collective economy, a collective history of relationships, and a land base that ties us together.
The early settlers suffered many hardships, mainly climate, raids from warring tribes like the Apaches, Comanches, and Navajos, and encroachment from outsiders. But through both Spanish and Mexican governance, Atrisqueños kept their merced intact. The end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 brought more challenges. Although the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to protect land grants in New Mexico territory, much property was lost through legal and illegal means over the next several decades.
There was a lot of ways that land speculators, attorneys, could kind of game the system.
In 1891, a federal court of private land claims was formed to sort out disputes. But even this process failed to protect the majority of New Mexico land grants.
By the 1960s, it's something more like 98% of all land claims are lost.
But presented with a petition from 225 incorporators and records to back up their claims, the court reaffirmed the Atrisco Grant in 1894.
The Court of Private Land Claims was part of the process of having heirs come forward through a judicial review to prove their ownership in the land grant as a whole. So heirs had to come forward at that time and stake their claim, essentially. And many heirs did, and unfortunately some heirs did not. That problem would haunt us in the years forward.
Nevertheless, in 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt signed a U.S. patent conveying more than 82,000 acres, the amount determined by an official land survey, to the town of Atrisco. The 20th century presented a new set of problems for the Atrisco Grant owners. The agricultural and grazing economy, which had sustained many of the heirs, began to decline, and they sought other ways to benefit from the common lands. Some development did occur, including the sale of land for small airports and what became the Westgate Heights housing subdivision. And, in later years, a portion of the land was sold to be preserved in the Petroglyph National Monument. But few heirs benefited from the land sales.
Atrisco was kind of relegated to be the little brother of Albuquerque to some degree. And some of the kind of political energy and political power that was wielded from in Atrisco, it just kind of dissipated. And you could see how, definitely 50s and 60s, Albuquerque basically then just kind of swallows Atrisco whole and overtakes it.
In 1967, in the midst of the movement to reclaim land grants in northern New Mexico, led by charismatic preacher Reyes Lopez Tijerina, the New Mexico legislature approved a bill to allow land grants to be reorganized as for-profit corporations. A faction of the board moved to incorporate the Atrisco Land Grant as Westland Development, a shareholding company.
I don't know if there were a clash of philosophies, there were just differences of approaches, maybe. Tijerina was like, a shooting star. Basically opened the eyes of community land grant heirs, particularly with regard to the international implications of this question and how it is related to the issue of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Some of the people at the forefront of that movement were Atrisqueños. Tijerina's right-hand man, his bodyguard, was someone from Atrisco.
1967, there's the infamous courthouse right in Tierra Maria. So this is, their most successful, most visible activism, in the mid to late 60s. And amidst that, the Westland Corporation, comes into being.
So you had a combination of people that felt like activism and protest was one of the strategies to kind of be recognized, to understand that we do have a tie to this land and we want our rights to the land. On the other side, you do have people that had, a formal education, that had ties to politicians, that had ties and a strong understanding of law and land use law and development practices, and they felt like that was the strategy to go towards.
There were many of that generation who advocated people to move on from those traditional economies. Joseph Montoya, the senator at the time, was telling people, look, those are the bygone days.
You had to either say you were an heir or not, and if you didn't say you were an heir, you actually lost all your rights to the grant. So unfortunately, my grandpa, mistrusting and not really knowing or having any kind of resource to really get the correct information, decided not to declare because he didn't trust what it meant. And that happened to many, many folks.
The proposition came to a vote in 1967, and those who did claim to be herederos voted 583 to 528 to approve the creation of Westland. For many, this was the first step on the path of losing the history, heritage, and culture of Atrisco. The move to incorporate sparked decades of acrimony as shareholders accused the Westland Board of abuses, heirs and board members feuded among themselves, and the promises of lucrative development failed to materialize.
Unfortunately, one of the downsides of turning the Atrisco Land Grant into Westland Development Corporation is that it really depersonalized the entire land grant purpose. Prior to this, the belief was that the land grant was a community asset for the benefit of the community members. When we shifted into more of a corporate status where you were holding a share of stock, it became very impersonal for the heirs.
There was a bad move that was made because the land base was obliterated.
So people are saying, well, we converted this for survival. We thought it would provide some form of economic means for the families, but no one's really benefiting aside from the people that are on the board and their relatives and their connections.
When you mentioned the word Westland Corporation, that was just synonymous with corruption. I mean, it was to that point that people just really felt it because, there was evidence that money was coming in, there was no money going out, people weren't getting a benefit, it's not like shareholders were getting their checks, and nothing was happening.
If we're all being honest, they were not very productive. So while they were supposed to be a development corporation, they really did very few projects that had development outcomes.
Even after a reform slate of board candidates assumed control in 1989, many shareholders continued to complain of insider trading and urged changes in the board's direction.
Atrisco para los atrisqueños, but it was a lie. It was not Atrisco for the Atrisqueños. It was how are we going to figure out a way to sell this thing to give the upper echelon shareholders a profit.
That's why you had a huge movement against them to try to take our land back and take back control of our, not just our land, but kind of our destiny to some degree.
But as the 20th century came to an end, two factors came into play.
The pressures were mounting for Westland and the Atrisco Land Grant because the city of Albuquerque had been growing east, north, and south and had pretty much maxed out its opportunities in those directions. And the only open space left for the city to grow was west, the Atrisco Land Grant.
That pressure was compounded by an artificially induced nationwide real estate boom driven by subprime mortgages issued to unqualified buyers.
It caused real estate prices to rise. And as real estate prices began to rise, interest in the Atrisco Land Grant and all that open space for property development began to rise as well. They began to become a target for buyers, real estate development companies, national organizations, out-of-state entities interested in buying the west side of Albuquerque.
The fate of the grant would be determined in 2006 when the Westland Board called for a vote to sell the remaining 50,000 plus acres of common lands to a California corporation, SunCal. Reformers, such as the concerned heirs of Atrisco, contested the sale.
Concerned heirs of Atrisco really evolved before the sale was announced. I would say the sale was a reaction against this group organizing to retake the corporation. There was no announcement of a sale until well after we were organizing and kind of agitating to change direction. And once that happened, all of our energy then shifted towards, we got to stop this sale.
There was a lot of contentious behavior going on during that time frame, a lot of unhappy people, a lot of differing opinions. But ultimately, following corporate law, Westland took a vote of the shareholders, and over 70% of these shareholders, heirs, chose to sell.
Westland reaped $250 million from the sale. For the nearly 6,000 registered heirs, it meant an average payout of $37,000, according to Forbes magazine. The 9 board members split $15 million.
By the time of the sale, when Westland turns to SunCal and that last sale does happen, you know, people were more than willing to sell. They don't remember sheep grazing, they don't remember cattle, they don't remember actually living off the land because their grandfather's father did that. They haven't done that for generations at this point. And so for them, you know, selling just made sense. You know, especially people who probably don't have a lot of money to start with. So, wait, I can sign off on something that I don't even use and you're gonna give me $20,000 for it? Sign me up, give me that check. You know, I wanna go buy a pickup.
Meanwhile, others mourned the sale.
You know, when Westland was created and then when Westland sold out the whole thing, my observation was the whole thing was, it was a traumatic event.
It causes what I call spirit injury.
It disrupted, dismembered the body.
Basically, in my lifetime, I've gone from us looking up there to the West Mesa and pointing and saying, you know, those are our traditional lands, to becoming a landless peasant.
You have a family that's built up over 3 centuries that had a huge family fight. And so for those that didn't think that that land should be sold, it's like Grandpa's house was sold and you can't go visit Grandpa's house anymore.
While all that's left of the original Atrisco Merced are 3 cemeteries and an historic chapel, heirs remain concerned about land use and economic development. And public officials grapple daily with the challenge of maintaining the rural character of the South Valley while planning for suburban growth on the west side.
We are looking for economic justice, and that means we want as many jobs as there is on the other side of the river.
Through poor planning and, you know, the lack of infrastructure, residents of the Southwest area really feel, you know, they've been neglected throughout the years and feel that they've contributed to taxes and to the growth of the city through its workforce and really developing the city as a whole, and not really gotten their fair share in return.
We want to be able to live on that side of the river and work on that side of the river and shop on that side of the river and go to the bank on that side of the river and go to the dry cleaner on that side. You know, very simple things that I'm asking for as a county commissioner and as a resident of the Southwest Mesa. Everybody else has in the city of Albuquerque. We do not have that.
Yet, the biggest controversy on Atrisco land centers on a proposed 13,700-acre mixed-use development known as Santolina, an initiative of Western Albuquerque Land Holdings, the company Barclays Bank of London formed with investors after foreclosing on the SunCal property.
As a county commissioner, I definitely want to make sure that that dream stays alive, that we protect agricultural land from development. But without us developing in the South Valley, where do we go? So we go to Mesa del Sol and we go to Santolina, we go to the Southwest Mesa.
There's concern over Santolina and the growth, and I think it's on many fronts. I mean, I think it's on the water, it's on sprawl, it's on whether we want to grow in an urban type setting. And we've never had the planning. Now I think it's our opportunity to plan.
Supporters of the approved master plan note that Santolina, unlike previous West Side subdivisions, is required to provide job opportunities before it can fully build out housing. But concerns remain.
I think the idea of Santolina is still driven off an old sprawl concept of development, still off that post-World War II development. And Albuquerque hasn't really caught up to the sort of development that is in the market.
The reality is what we need to do is find ways of maintaining affordability in some of these older areas. We need to upgrade infrastructure in some of these areas so they can handle greater capacity, and we need to get serious about connecting via public transit. I don't see anywhere in that how creating a new city, miles out on the Ceja is going to actually solve any of those issues.
But short of purchasing the land, the city and county can only exert so much control over development of the property.
You have organizations that accuse me of supporting, large corporations, big business, big bankers, Well, they own the land, and they're going to develop that land. Some of the heirs of the Atrisco Land Grant want to be able to get their land back. Nothing would make me happier. But look, at the end of the day, even if it was the original owners and the original families from the Atrisco Land Grant who own that land, I am not going to allow them to develop it without a master plan.
If the county commission would not have approved that development plan, it would have left it up to chance in terms of the owners being able to parcel it off, much like Pajarito Mesa, which is something that we really absolutely can't afford.
It's worse than a third world country right here in the United States of America. They have no water, they have no electricity, and that's one thing that we want to make sure never happens ever again.
As heirs face a landless existence for the first time in 300 years, they pursue many paths in their attempts to preserve the heritage of Atrisco. In 2012, heirs convinced the state legislature to recognize the town of Atrisco Grant Merced as a political subdivision.
Even though we don't have our land base intact, we have to get our land back one way or the other. The future, I think, is still bright. The land is not going away. It continues to be there, and so that's ongoing.
I think for the town of Atrisco Land Grant and for that board, there is a distinct possibility of getting the land back. Whether they're going to get the whole 80,000 acres, that's a much more tall task, right? But like many land grants, the town of Tomé has done it piece by piece. You're very strategic, you're almost surgical in your approach to what land you're going to get back.
To commemorate Atrisco, the community envisioned a West Side Visitor Center and museum. Councilor Pena and Commissioner Quesada have partnered with local, state, and federal officials to make that happen. They also hope to gain an open space designation for a plot of land that overlooks one of Atrisco's original settlements. Both work closely with groups like the West Central Community Development Group and Southwest Alliance of Neighbors to bring needed improvements to the Southwest area. As part of the SunCal sale, the company agreed to underwrite a foundation to carry on the history and legacy of Atrisco at a cost of $1 million a year for 100 years. The Atrisco Companies was formed to carry on that legacy, and it set up the foundation. But after only 3 annual payments, SunCal went bankrupt in 2009 after the real estate bubble burst, and Barclays Bank foreclosed on the land. But Atrisco Companies, using the $3 million in seed money, formed several new companies.
Now, our main purpose with that money was to immediately try to provide our heirs with benefits that they felt were never offered or provided by Westland. So we set up a number of programs early on to utilize the money to provide scholarships and various programs for our kids to get educations through summer camps and summer programs and scholarships so that we could give back to our community.
Sanchez believes the Atrisco companies have fulfilled the land grant's intent by becoming a social enterprise, focusing on education, cultural preservation, and economic development.
The community and the Atrisco heirs benefit from the Atrisco companies today in lots of ways.
They gave scholarships in partnership with the Hispanic Scholarship Fund. So they gave about 40 scholarships a year to heirs that were at CNM, UNM, at schools across the country. I received the scholarship 3 times. The companies really watched out for me. I think it's because I really took an interest in it, and I really do credit, being in the Congresswoman's office now to them and their mentorship.
Like many proud Atrisco heirs, Sophia believes heeding the wisdom of elders and maintaining customs and traditions is crucial.
My grandfather was very important to me, and I think we had a special relationship. He instilled, just identity that helped me be confident in life, that maybe I wouldn't have been if it wasn't for him, that I could, I kind of went through life thinking I could accomplish whatever because of what he told me and the importance of our people and our land and our history.
So it's not about an acre, 5 acres, 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, 90,000 acres. It's not about that. It's about what does it mean to perpetuate your idea of your people.
I think what our elders in our community need to understand is that they need to teach us about the history of the land grant. That's what will get lost if we don't know it. It's admirable, and it's a great fight to try to get physical land back, but if we don't have the land in our hearts and minds and that history to carry on to our children, then it will truly be lost.
I have great hope in the young people who now have that connection in their hands, and so their next steps will be important. I think that in keeping the knowledge alive within themselves and within the future generations ensures that the land grants themselves will live, and all of those connections and all of those concerns also ensure that the landscape will somehow survive.
We have spaces where our grandparents grew up that have been forgotten. And they're sitting there in disrepair. And it's not that nobody cares, I just think a lot of people specifically from the community kind of feel helpless and they don't understand how to reinvigorate life in those spaces. And I think for me personally, my mission is really to find a way to do that. Whether it's through actually developing, doing rehab of these spaces, finding ways and partnerships to create cultural-based programming so we remember kind of the old stories, we remember who we are. We start connecting to some of the old ceremonies that we once conducted. To me, I feel like that is the most effective way forward, is really leading by our hearts, understanding who we are as a people, reconnecting to our history, and starting to tell some of those old stories again.
Colorín colorado, este cuento no se acaba. The story is not over yet.